Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of our livestock update. I'm Scott Greiner, and coming to you from campus, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Appreciate everybody joining us. A couple of housekeeping items as we get started. If you've got questions for our speakers, we'll be happy to address those. Probably the easiest way to facilitate that is if you've got a question and want to chat, type it in the chat box. That would be great. We'll also, if we've got ample time, we can open up the microphones and let you ask those questions in person. I think we've got a nice lineup of updates today. As we've historically done with this webinar, we've asked our colleagues at VDAX to join us, and happy to have Mr. John Beam, who works with the Livestock Marketing Group, portion of VDAX here in Southwest Virginia. John's joined us again this Friday noon to give us an update on what's happening in the cattle markets and with the livestock markets. So, John, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, what I want to do is just go over our what's happened here in the past 100 days since cattle markets and everything else in our lives have been kind of going for a loop. So, and then looking ahead just a little bit, I'm an economist, and I don't claim to forecast what markets are going to do, but just some things to think about. But anyway, getting started with where we are now. We're about where we were, as far as the futures market, we're about where we were in mid-March. The markets are right around, for fat cattle, right around 98 to $1 pound, and back in January, the futures market were around $1.20. Feeder cattle futures contracts in mid-January and February were in the mid-150s. This week they're in the mid-130s. In April they went as low as 113. So we have seen a rebound from their lows. Cash market for our cattle that we are mostly selling, they held firm through the spring back in January and February before COVID hit. Although we never did. Normally we would expect a spike in the markets prices especially for grazing kind of cattle that are headed to grazing programs, but we never did see that happen if it hadn't. So fortunately, if there is a upside to COVID, it was fortunate that it hit it in the spring as opposed to hitting in the fall, when if that would have happened in the fall when we have a abundance of cattle and the markets, it's a lot of pressure on feeder cattle, it would have really been disastrous for the cattle markets, feeder cattle especially. This week in Virginia, weighted average prices for large and medium steers were weighing 500 to 600, 147.25. Six weight steers were weighted average was 140.40. Large and medium one muscled heifers, 5 weights were averaged 120, while the 6 weights were 115. In the past couple of weeks, we've seen some really strong prices, especially for 7 weights. About 2 weeks ago, there were some board cattle. They were bringing sold. There were some reputation kind of cattle. They brought as high as $1.55. I don't know. We wouldn't expect that all the time, but it shows there is some demand for some feeder cattle. This pandemic has caused quite a bit of turmoil in managing marketing and feeding programs, and here's some things that I think we need to keep in mind when we look back over this thing. Of course, a lot of plants had to shut down because of sickness in the plants. They dropped back to killing very few cattle for what they normally would do. So consequently, cattle got held back. Some got turned out back out on some kind of grass or forage. Some of them were put on a maintenance program where they weren't gaining. Others were probably too far gone to make a change on that. So consequently, carcass weights are at this point in time are 50 pounds heavier than this time last year, which is caused by those having to hold them back. I've heard them being weighing as much as 1,800 pounds. I even heard the other day that there were some cattle that got sold that were weighing right at a ton. So I don't recall that ever happening. So it's a pretty phenomenal event that's going on. Looking at May 1 feedlot placements, they were 78% of last year, while the marketings were 76% of last year. Those are extremely low numbers if you follow cattle on feed numbers, and but it was because the slaughter plants were backed up, and feedlot guys didn't have anywhere to put cattle, and it was just jammed everything up. The June 1 cattle on feed report just came out last week, showed cattle on feed over 150 days. There's 43% higher of them this year than last year, what puts that number at about 971,000. So we're, plus the cattle that are on feed over 120 days were 23% higher than last year. And those are numbers that are very high, very much out of line. So you can see why we're a million head behind at the slaughter plants and for where we need to be for this time of year. So those are your reasons for having carcass weights 50 pounds heavier than a year ago. Now, to relieve this backlog of cattle in the feedlots, packers need to be killing about 700,000 head of cattle a week. Normally, it's about 650,000 head, which they have just gotten right up at that this week. Maybe last week they were very close to it. So we are back close to killing about the same number of cattle that is normally expected. The choice box beef cutouts in mid-March, which those choice cutouts, that's what the packers are selling to the retail suppliers, grocery stores, restaurants. Back in mid-March, those were at $208 just before the rally in the box beef started. They reached within, I guess, about 8 weeks, they reached a record high of $475. So they jumped from $208 to $475 at the high on May 12th. And then this week they've dropped back to about $208 or $209. So when they had beef priced at $475, they was reported that those packers were making close to normal. They were making close to $2,000 a head. Of course, they weren't killing as many, and they probably had some costs that were not normally counted, but they were making a lot of money. Consumer demand for the higher dollar cuts, steaks, loins, and so forth has dropped, while ground beef demand has increased, which I'm sure many of you know that and maybe have experienced it, and we certainly have read about it. So some other hot topics going on in the industry. Some of it's legislative and some of it's through the courts, but there's been legislation that has been introduced to require that 50% of slaughter cattle be sold on negotiated cash trade. And the reason for this is to get a better price discovery. There are over the years, there have the amount of cattle that have traded or negotiated or through negotiated cash trade or negotiated carcass trade has dropped. And this, we need price discovery because there's so much formulas, so many contracts are based on live prices. So we need to know where we are and what cattle are worth. So that legislation's been introduced. There's some fair amount of controversy over whether that's the way to go or not, but we'll see what happens. It seems to be in the upper Midwest, Iowa, Nebraska. They sell about 50% negotiated cattle every week. You get down into go further south in the Texas Panhandle. They trade very little negotiated. I've seen it as little as 7%, and there are some plants that don't buy any cattle on negotiated trade. The next item is the Department of Justice, DOJ, has started an investigation into the 4 major beef packers over concerns of monopolistic activities. Senator Chuck Grassley from Ohio has asked USDA why packers and stockyards investigation has not been completed from the Tyson plant fire in Holcomb, Kansas last fall. And that really, if you remember reading about it, that's kind of what started a lot of the frustration with packers. They jumped the price going out the back door to the retailers and the restaurants. They dropped the price they were given feedlot for the fat cattle. So there was a lot of, it looked like there was some manipulation going on there with the prices. And actually and the reason for their concern was they said, well, they couldn't kill as many, that we weren't going to be able to kill as many cattle as nationally as needed to be. So, but actually the next week they killed more cattle. So there's some question as to what was going on there. And there's been a lot of push to find out. Senator Grassley has said if a report is not forthcoming, he will request an investigation into PNS. Is why it's not being completed. But another item, and there's a group called Central Grocery. I don't know whether it's a group or company or a association, but they're in Minnesota, and they have filed a class action suit against the 4 major packers, accusing them of collusion and price fixing on boxed beef prices that retail suppliers were charged during the March to May pandemic fiasco. And that the packers set the price going to those retail and restaurant suppliers. So it's not really a bid thing. I mean, they don't get to bid on it. So they just were jacking the price up, which there was certainly less product because they weren't killing as many, but there's many of them thinking it might have been some collusion going on with the other packers to do that. Now, one upside to the COVID, I hesitate to call it an upside or a positive, but one thing that has resulted from it that has may be a good thing is the huge demand for locally produced and processed beef and pork, and local custom processing facilities are reportedly booked through 2020 and even into 2021. Farmers who market their beef are selling product as quickly as they have it available. Now, if this is not a short-term fad, it could have a tremendous positive impact on Virginia cattle producers and processors. In fact, from what I understand, the VDACS, Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Meat Inspection Service, they are receiving lots of calls for inspection service at new facilities or upgrades at existing facilities. And I would like to point out that and I don't know the exact details, but Virginia VDACS meat inspectors, they can provide USDA inspection so that beef can be sold in cuts, or it can be retailed after it's cut up. It doesn't. So in other words, it doesn't. We have that ability. If your processor is USDA inspected, you can sell your cuts you can retail them. So it's not apparently in other states it's difficult. They're going to have custom kill plants where you cannot sell the retail cuts, but we do have that. We do have that service with VTAX Meat Inspection. Here's some items to consider throughout the year and marketing your calf crop. Your fall calves, we might be a little better. Well, it's just going to be sooner marketing them, so we're a little better know what might happen. But we get on into the fall. Here's some things I want to point out. There's two schools of thought on where the market might be going. The negative is the things that, such as backlog of slaughter cattle, which is probably close to 1 million head, and with some of them, and they're heavy cattle, some extremely heavy, as I just mentioned a little bit ago. So there's a lot of beef on the market. It's not just the number of head. There's a lot of a lot of extra weight to them. The negative beef movement of low demand of high end cuts like steaks and loins cuts, that's been that has dropped, as I mentioned a while ago. So that your high end cuts and high dollar cuts, there's less demand for them, although we got a higher demand for ground products. So there's probably a lot of those. I understand a lot of the select beef is going into further processing of some sort. Maybe it could even be getting ground. So, and we've also lost demand for both domestic and export, which was caused by extremely high prices during April and May, with those box prices getting up to a record $475. And there was of course, some limited availability as well. But all those factors will probably cause some lower live prices throughout the year, and until the beef supply can get back in line with demand. Now, the positive thing, that prices may stay favorable through and are steady at least through the summer and into the end of the year, with improving economy and anticipation of a return to more normal business activities. Of course, I just heard this morning that there's some of the states that are opening up, they're having more cases, so I don't know where that's going to lead to. So I don't guess anybody does for sure. And so the other thing is that with that low feedlot placement in May, there's some thoughts that there could be a hole, so to speak, in slaughter cow numbers later this fall, allowing for a catch-up in the backlog of heavy slaughter cattle. Frequently, it looks like, though, when the industry talks about having a hole in a slaughter cattle numbers, there's somehow that hole gets filled and never happens. So when they start talking about that, I always know that, it probably ain't going to happen, because they talk about it so much, everybody's going to make sure there's a spot, there's going to be filled. So, but other farmer feeders, they're looking at the possibility of cheap corn and abundance of corn, and very likely would like to add value to their corn crop through the cattle. And then another issue is, while the cash market for slaughter cattle has not been profitable for cattle feeders, if there were any feeders that were hedged in some way, were contracted or hedged the cattle back there in the winter, they could have very well made some money on cattle, or at least they made money on their hedge. And actually, I heard something yesterday that one reason I think these feeder cattle are selling pretty well right now is a lot of these, they're probably like a lot of us, they've gotten money for the payroll protection, and they've gotten money from the CFAP. So maybe they're just out there putting that money back into feeder cattle. So which would be nice to know that the money's getting put back into circulation like that. Some things to think about is marking your calf crop throughout this year and then into the fall. I would strongly encourage you to consider weaning and selling commingled and load lots, such as through VQA or Virginia Quality Assured sales that are sponsored by the Virginia Cattlemen's Association. Another option might be consider selling through either through in-barn sales as commingled graded, or as uniform lots of one owner. If there's that option at your market, I certainly would encourage you to sell them through a graded sale, of course. But everybody has their preference they want to sell. Another thing to keep in mind is, as always, cattle of good quality with a history of vaccination, they're weaned for 45 plus days, and with acceptable or desirable flesh have always been proven to be in higher demand than unweaned cattle with no history of a health program. So, and I wanted to add this in here, that this year has been proof that producers need to familiarize themselves and know their options in regards to risk management, such as LRP, which is livestock price protection, or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange using options or hedging. One of these, using these may or may not be an option for everyone, but I feel like everyone needs to at least have a basic understanding of how they work and be prepared to use it if you think it's suitable for your operation. Here's an example. In the 2020 fall contracts in January and February of this year, they were in the mid 150s. By April, those prices had dropped to 115 to $1.20, and today they're around in the mid 130s. Even though cash prices may not have suffered as much, there is still some lost profit from not having that protection. So, you know, there's a lot of controversy over whether they work or not, but it's, you know, I'm certainly used to buying insurance for everything else I own, and I'm sure most of you are too. So it's maybe we need to consider having insurance on protecting our profit on our feeder cattle or calves, either one. We should maybe be at least better educated about it than what I think a lot of us are. So, Scott, that completes, I think, everything for me. So, if anybody has any questions, or if you have time for them, or want me to hang on here, or Scott's put my email address up there. So, if you want to email me any questions today or later on when you think about them, well, you feel free to do so. So,
Thank you, John, for that comprehensive update. Very much appreciated. If we got time for a quick question, if somebody's got one and want to put it in the chat box, or if you want to unmute and ask that. While we're doing that, John Benner is going to be our next speaker. John's Extension agricultural agent in Augusta County. John, I've unshared my screen if you'd like to go ahead and pull your slides up. John and his colleague Matt Bohr, along with several other folks, have done a lot of work on this concept of summer stockpiling as we thought about what we've had weather-wise and kind of where we're headed. We thought this would be a good topic. And John, appreciate you joining us, and look forward to your comments.
All right, Scott, can you, everyone hear me okay?
It's good.
All right, so Scott and some of the other folks at Tech asked me to cover summer stockpiling, and I wanted to start my talk with a definition of stockpiling I found while reading Jim Garish's book, Kick the Hay Habit. Jim Garish is one of the renowned forage management experts, did some work in academia in the University of Missouri and other places. Anyway, he has in his definition of stockpiling, stockpiling is the process of accumulating standing forage growth during the growing season to be grazed during periods of little or no growth. While we generally think of stockpiling as a program for winter grazing, it can also be employed in some climates for standing forage during heat or drought-induced summer dormancy. So a lot of us probably think of fall stockpiling tall fescue, certainly an excellent forage management decision, excellent way to extend the grazing season, saves a lot of money in terms of reducing hay expense. When we think about a lot of the cool season forages we have in Virginia, they really have a lot of growth early in the year. I would say right now, just kind of dovetailing with John's comments and the feeder cattle market being up around the spring. And that's really due to all the grass growth that we have. A lot of it comes within probably a 8-week period. And really that tall fescue growth curve you see on this slide really runs, mid-April when green up occurs into June, depending on the year. I think we've had a good amount of rain so far this year, but we're really going to be heading into just sort of the summer slump and doldrums. When we talk about fall stockpiling, we're really trying to harvest the fall growth that can occur with cooler temperatures as our cool season grasses, particularly fescue, begin to pick up in productivity with cooler temperatures and autumn rains. Strip grazing that through the fall is an effective way to extend our grazing. However, in my experience as an agent working with producers, a lot of us have challenges with fall stockpiling. Lack of infrastructure. If we're renting ground in different areas, we've got fence issues. We may have electric fence limitations. Maybe we have water as a resource limitation. Not having land to stockpile. If we're trying to put together load lots on our own, there's some economies of scale for having a high stocking rate. But as John mentioned in his talk, if we can commingle our calves and get onto a tractor trailer load that way, get that premium, by participating in some of those VQA, VCA sales, reduce our stocking rate a little bit to be able to graze a little bit longer. Really, we can reduce a lot of the variable costs associated with our beef operation when we evaluate that. When we get into the summer slump, if we haven't really adequately thought out where we're going to stockpile in the fall, it becomes an intense challenge to be able to do that. Maybe we're running out of grass in general. The springtime is about the only time of the year where grass growth is going to exceed our, livestock, our herd demands in terms of forage demand. In the summer, the forage demand, probably depending on how we're stocked, is now going to exceed any grass growth that we have. So one potential solution was to summer stockpile cool season grasses. So really want to give credit to David Fisk, who is the superintendent at the Shenandoah Valley Research Station for roughly 18 years. Those of you that are familiar with that research station, it is about an operation of around 500 acres of fescue-based pasture. Normally there are around 220 to 230 cows that are exposed to breeding, putting that stocking rate around 2 acres per cow. And over the early years as being the superintendent, David Fisk noticed that all that overabundance of pasture growth that very often we put into hay production to be able to feed out later in the winter, that in some instances he was having to roll it back out and feed it in the fall to be able to do any type of stockpiling. And so his development and his novel idea was, what if I just take out some of the spring growth that maybe I was going to make hay on, especially some of that acreage that I've got the fence and the water to graze? What if I just rest it from green up all the way to mid to late summer and then graze it while I set up and rest fall stockpiled acreage? All right, some of the questions that go into that are, what is the expense of doing that compared to maybe feeding hay in the fall or earlier in the winter? And also, probably very critically, what is the quality of that grass? I mean, you have all of that spring growth get mature. Is it really going to support our cow herd if we're trying to graze it in that summer slump time frame? All right, so the results of him doing that, and I'll kind of walk through a couple steps on how to implement summer stockpiling. He combined summer stockpiling, which pretty much he set aside a percent of his acreage from spring to late summer, and then began to strip graze it. In doing so, that enabled him to fall stockpile a larger amount of pasture for a longer amount of time. And in doing so, he was able to increase the grazing days of the research station to around an average of 270 days a year. That varies depending on climate and year-to-year conditions. Also, he found the quality of that summer stockpile was pretty similar to first cutting hay, but when you compared it on a cost basis, it had a feed savings of around $1.37 a head a day compared to if you had to feed hay. So again, kind of recapping those points, the amount of acreage that he looked at stockpiling, he put at 20% of total grazable acreage. One benefit of doing this is in pulling out that percentage of acreage for resting through a summer stockpile, he increased the stock density on the remaining rotational grazing system. And actually that helps early in the spring when you have that robust cool season grass growth and your cattle herd is better able to utilize that forage. Not as much of it gets mature within that rotational system. They're able to get, better, more nutritious forage more consistently by increasing that stock density. As grass growth slows down, he then would begin to move into the summer stockpile. And actually he found, just like you would find with fall grazing or winter grazing, fall stockpiled growth, that strip grazing was the best way to manage that and really stretch the grazing days out on his summer stockpiled acreage. So this is a Google image map of one of the areas there at the research station. Here, this is about a 16-acre paddock area with a couple different smaller paddocks within it. Looking at around 20 to 25% here in green is the 4-acre summer stockpile. So from green up through mid-July, you've got that 20%, 25%, 4 acres in a summer stockpile, and the cattle herd's rotating through the remaining acreage, in this scenario, 12 acres. Another point David would also often point out to us is he would rotate that acreage around in the system that he summer stockpiled, so that each area got summer stockpiled only once every 4 years. So moving into midsummer, looking into mid-July, mid-August, about the time we're about to move into now, he would pull out another 4 acres from the grazing rotation, and thinking forward to what he wanted to stockpile in the fall, he would concentrate grazing more intensely on 50% of the acres that he wanted to set up for fall stockpiling. A lot of forage experts have told us that the best canopy for a fall stockpile is a vegetative residual that's been uniformly grazed into the mid and late July timeframe, and then rotated out of and rested, fertilized, and left alone for 90 days until the growth curve slows down with frosts and a slowdown of the growing season. And he used that to really set up more acreage in terms of fall stockpiling. So into August, he begins to strip graze the summer stockpile. And actually, if you look through that color, you can kind of see how those strips really laid out as he moved through those paddocks. He would really try to stretch the acreage through August and into October. In good years where he had a lot of fall moisture, he could then move the cattle herd from the stockpile, the summer stockpile, into the 4 acres here that he began to rest in July. After that, you're probably looking around time frame of late October, November. He's finally ready to begin stockpiled grazing on the fall stockpile. So looking at a picture here of what a summer stockpiled field looks like, you have a lot of dead mature growth that you can kind of see throughout this slide, but you also see a lot of vegetative undergrowth that really provides a lot of nutritive value for various types of livestock. And looking here, here's an example of the strip grazing system. You've got a cow moving on to a fresh set of stockpiled tall fescue here in the summer. A lot of dense green undergrowth, and you can see over here on the right side, they're utilizing most of that forage. So really strip grazing is probably the best management tool you need to combine with summer stockpiling. So on costs, these are the cost estimates we used for looking at the cost of deferring grazing in the spring on the summer stockpile, and then the cost per cow per day grazing. So we did have an opportunity cost of not grazing earlier. Labor in terms of strip grazing, prorated supplies used to help facilitate the strip grazing management. And we arrived at around 34 cents a cow a day to feed them and let them graze on a summer stockpile. We compared that using hay in a traditional system, especially if you are feeding hay in the fall, if it gets dry, or if you're trying to save some pasture to fall stockpile. We used actual fertilizer and lime costs, and some of the other assumptions here are from the Extension Enterprise budgets, and we arrived at $1.73 to feed a cow hay a day under actual hay production there at the research station. So we do see a lot of cost savings. Probably the biggest question we've had from producers is, what is the quality associated with that summer stockpile? And pretty much the most concise answer we have is it's just about equal in most cases to first cutting hay. So here we've got a few different samples from a few different years throughout the Shenandoah Valley. Pretty much you can kind of see the range from 54 to 59% TDN, from around 8% to 15% crude protein. As you could expect, the dry matter's a little bit higher, with it being a much drier, more fibrous forage, but pretty much equal to a lot of first cutting hay, a lot cheaper than first cutting hay. For 2 years, we did have a study with a esophageal fistulated steer we borrowed from campus, and pretty much under strip grazing conditions, we didn't see a lot of selectivity by the steer versus what we were able to sample in the field. Here we also did have total ergot alkaloids that we looked at. Pretty much the main things I can kind of comment on there is it doesn't seem to be, at least compared to total ergot alkaloid levels for tall fescue and other scenarios and settings, to be prohibitive in and of itself. We'll talk about the grazing days. But over the 2 years, we had 60 days on average of grazing on that summer stockpile using strip grazing methods. So looking at total yield, and again, it depends on a whole lot of factors, species composition of the forage, what is the cool season, grass makeup, the history, management history, soil fertility. Probably the biggest things that we could control in terms of the yield is making sure nothing grazed early in the year after green up. But pretty much on average, kind of looking at these sampling dates, you could maybe expect about 5,000 pounds of dry matter on average, keeping some of those external factors constant. Talking on that point I mentioned of grazing a summer stockpiled field after green up, we did have a producer in Rockingham County do a demonstration for us over 2 years, and in 2018 and 2019 he had a group of heifers rotationally graze through a paddock and summer stockpiled in adjacent paddock, and we took yield samples in July of 2018 and July and August in 2019, and as you might expect, we did find a significant difference, pretty much, or at least a nominal difference in the yield when we rest that forage from green up on versus if we try to graze it early in the year. Probably more importantly is the grazing days that we hope to get from summer stockpiling. Very critical to reducing the cost of feeding hay over the course of a winter or in a dry fall. And again, if you look at the 2016, 2017 data that was from the research station, where we're combining summer stockpile grazing days with fall stockpiling, pretty much we had that average of around 60 days over both years. As you can see, that first year, 68 days on the summer stockpile, 53 days on the second year, and then extending that out to a fall stockpiling time frame where we were able to graze for over 2 months in both years. So very effective in terms of extending the grazing season. These other demonstrations here, Augusta and Page, we found in Augusta that strip grazing is definitely the way to go to get the most forage allocation, the most grazing days. We did not do that in that demonstration. We did not have as many grazing days, partially due to that. And also with the Page demonstration, and actually both of those demonstrations, definitely needing to tie that summer stockpiling effort with a fall stockpiling effort as well to extend that grazing season. Also in the Augusta demo site, we didn't have as great of a yield because we had cattle wintered on that pasture. So to sum up some of the economic data, pretty much 60 days late summer grazing per year on the summer stockpile, hopefully getting us around 90 days grazing on a fall stockpile. Using the cost savings we demonstrated between summer stockpile grazing and feeding hay, that pretty much arrived at $36 a cow a year. So to kind of put that together, we really felt that summer stockpiling was a tool and best should be used as a tool to facilitate fall stockpiling and winter grazing. We can maybe expect around 5,000 pounds of dry matter based on just the demonstration work that we've done to try to figure out what yields we should try to shoot for when we reserve a percent of our grazing acres for a summer stockpile. And just kind of think about what we could do with 5,000 pounds of dry matter per acre in a time, early August, late July, where we normally don't have near that much in most of our pastures. So rethinking stockpiling. So here's that forage growth curve again. We've got the fall stockpile. We're bridging that forage gap not just during winter dormancy, but summer dormancy as well. And in doing so, hopefully we can extend grazing into that winter dormancy. So there's our cool season grass growth curve. And just think of summer stockpiling just being a bridge between those two growth areas for cool season forages. So some final considerations. If you are considering using summer stockpiling, again, it works very well in acreage where we're making hay only to roll it back out to our cattle herd in a dry fall. If we can graze instead of making hay, really dovetails in there very nicely. We definitely need to strip graze to get the maximum efficiency from a summer stockpile. Shade and water locations, we probably don't worry about that for fall stockpiling, but we do in terms of grazing a summer stockpile in the late summer, early fall. Do we need the hay that maybe we're giving up by not making hay and summer stockpiling? Can we buy hay cheaper than we can make it? If so, maybe summer stockpiling will work for our operation. And again, probably this would be for any forage management change that we could consider making, is make sure we have enough hay to handle a long winter or a dry fall. So with that, I'll thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, John, for that overview, and always a consideration, particularly in a year like we're having, I think, is summer stockpiling. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask folks if they've got questions, put those in the chat box, and John, if you could respond to those directly there. And with that, Dr. Curran, we'll turn it over to you. Let you pull up your slides. John, you might need to unshare. And happy to have Dr. Curran with us, and going to visit about midsummer deworming. Dr. Curran?
Thank you, Dr. Greiner. My screen's up and everybody can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to count on you to cut me off when it's time, because as you well know, I will not stop on time probably. So when we get to 1 o'clock, let me know. I'm really going to focus on just the aspect of deworming that are going to affect us in the next 6 weeks. So this is not going to be an overview of everything deworming wise, but who are we going to think about deworming over the next 6 weeks? When do we want to do it, and what do we want to use? If we look, who's likely to benefit from deworming in the next 6 weeks, that would be our spring-born calves. Most of us should have already weaned and worked our fall-born calves. So we should have those out of the way from an aspect of deworming. Certainly if you had any of those that you're going to own for a month or more, you should probably deworm those calves. But I feel sure that most everybody's already worked those calves. But we would expect about 20 pounds of extra gain from deworming those spring-born calves sometime in the next 6 weeks. The other one would be the stalker people who have calves that were dewormed to turn out with a product other than long range. If they used long range at turnout, we would not expect those calves to need a second deworming during the summer growing season. And if these calves get dewormed again, this midsummer deworming, we'd expect about 20 pounds on average for those calves as well. So now we get to when do we deworm them? And this is a little bit of a complicated subject from the standpoint that we're trying to balance things together. We want to get the deworming in these springborn calves in the ideal time to benefit them from a deworming perspective and worm control. But also we want to try to marry that up with other things that we could potentially be doing to those calves that would be beneficial from the standpoint of only handling those cattle once during the summer. So I've kind of settled on a kind of a mid-July to mid-August deal. We would probably go in mid-July to the first of August from the standpoint of simply controlling worms and being an ideal time. But I'm going to let you slide into mid-August, realizing we might be just a little bit late than ideal deworming those calves, but that's going to be a good time, and a lot of people are going to be handling those calves then with a product or with other products for pre-weaning vaccination programs. Those springborn calves don't need to be dewormed before that because they really haven't been grazing. The pastures that they have been grazing would not have been most likely that heavily contaminated with larvae for them to pick up. So that's why we're not going to go earlier than that. Stocker calves, because those calves have been grazing since turnout, they're going to benefit from getting dewormed a little bit earlier. Now we're talking around the 4th of July, mid-July. If you have not employed a strategic deworming program, giving, for instance, Dectomax or Cydectin, and then re-deworming with those products in 8 weeks later. If we're just going to hit them in midsummer, potentially when we're also going to implant those calves, potentially do something for fly control, then we're looking at somewhere around the 1st of July to the middle of July as being the ideal time to hit those calves. And if we're going to do that, then deworming should be one of our primary goals for those calves, as well as to the timing of when we handle those calves. Moving on then, what do we use? So if we jump back to springborn calves there, you know, we have the white paste dewormers as one possibility. Those would be your products like Safeguard, Synanthic, and Valbazin. Gives you the opportunity to use a different class of dewormer than we use a lot of times. We don't have any lice like we would have in the fall or winter to worry about trying to control that we would not get with this product. The downside is there's no persistent activity, so it only clears the worms in the calf. And particularly for those of you that are hitting those calves earlier in that window I gave you that are going to have less worm burdens built up in their bodies, that's going to be a bit of a disadvantage. You do have to catch heads to give this product, and so that's a little bit of a disadvantage as well. So if we then look at pour-on dewormers, which make up the vast majority of the dewormers that are sold today, the pros for them on these springborn calves are you get some short-term fly control. So if we have some resistance issues to pyrethrins and or organophosphates, we can get some short-term fly control. It's only going to be for a few weeks, a couple of weeks probably, but we do have that advantage there. We can potentially do this without catching heads. These calves can be sorted off from their moms in a pen, and you can squirt these calves as they go by or run them down a lane and do them. Important thing here, though, is to remember we want to be sure we get the appropriate dose on these things to try to help with long-term buildup of resistance. And if you don't get enough on the animal because you're trying to do it without catching animals, you won't get the benefit if we don't get enough dewormer in them. The biggest con to our pour-on dewormers, and this is true for all classes of livestock and for all its uses, the blood levels that we get from the pour-on dewormers are much less consistent than if we use the injectable products. So we're looking at significant lower, well, we're looking at lower levels, but really the deal is the variability there, and a few of these animals not ever absorbing enough to get to the levels we want. and the potential for that leading to increased long-term issues with resistance. So if we then move to the injectables, we kind of have on the right-hand side of my slide there, we've got the injectables that are kind of all the same: Dectomax, Cydectin, generic ivermectin injectable, brown box Ivomec, the original product injectable there, all going to give you 2 or 3 weeks of persistent activity to those products. And then we've got long range that's going to give you 100 days of activity, at least against Ostratasia, the worm that we are most interested in trying to control. Like I said, with the Poron deal, more consistent blood levels and long range could provide all the deworming they need through fall. So if we're towards the tail end of my time frame for deworming these spring-born calves, if you think about it, if we deworm those calves middle of August, then 100 days puts us through to weaning. If those cattle were going to be weaned into a dry lot, they would really have had no opportunity to pick up more worms burdens than you could offset some of the upfront cost, the initial cost of that long range with not needing to deworm those calves again. We did a very large study about 5-6 years ago when long range first came on the market with spring-born calves. We actually dewormed those calves very early in the year. They were dewormed about the end of June, and we got 8 pounds additional gain versus using a Poron dewormer. So not a huge bump, but it was a bump in the weight gains when we used the long range product versus traditional. We did not have a negative control in that study. We wanted to compare it to what people were typically doing, and so that's what we did. We did fecal samples on those calves, and using, there's a lot of change in calf weight there. The company's recommendation is to deworm for the weight of the calf at the current time, and we got fecal samples on those calves at deworming, and then again at the end of the study, and it did appear that the long range was still effectively controlling the worms in spite of the fact that those calves had gained quite a bit of weight during that time and were a different weight class than what they were when we initially dewormed them. The cons are we don't get fly control from the injectables, and then we're back to having to catch heads pretty much for those calves when we're using injectable dewormers. If we move to stocker calves, then we've got a little bit different options now. We don't have the mama cows running with these calves. We move to the white paste dewormers, then we can potentially go and look at those. And Scott Greiner says I'm out of time. We can use the dewormers, the minerals, the feed, and the blocks, and not have to catch those heads. The Porons are the exact same deals with the Porons that we got with the spring-born calves, and with the stocker calves, we got the exact same deals with the injectables as far as the pros and cons with using them. So that kind of covers who we should be thinking about deworming over the next 4 to 6 weeks, and what products we should be considering and why. And hopefully that'll answer your questions. If you have any other questions for myself or any of the speakers, you can certainly put them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask them, and we'd all be glad to answer those. With that, Dr. Greiner, stop.
Thank you, Dr. Curran. Excellent overview as always. Folks, if you've got questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put those in the chat box. I was going to take just a second and if I can make my slides work. Just remind everybody, we recorded today's session as we recorded all these. They're all available on our VT Beef Extension website, and that's very easy to find. If you just plug that into Google, VT Beef Extension, you will find it. The address is there on the slide. Any questions for any of our speakers?